This is the Mitigating DNS Cyber Attacks workshop brought to you by ICANN Security and Stability Advisory Committee. My name is Jim Galvin. I'm the Vice Chair of SSAC, and this is the third in a series over the last few IGFs in which SSAC has brought a workshop to the IGF. In general, our plan is to look at the kinds of activities that SSAC has been involved in and engaged in over the past year, and it's an opportunity for us to make that work visible to this particular community. I'll start briefly with just an introduction of what SSAC is. We are an advisory committee formed in 2001, 2002 by ICANN. They provide guidance to ICANN's board, these advisory committees, supporting organizations, the staff, and to the general community. We write our documents and reports. We try to cover topics as broadly and generally as possible. We do try to provide specific guidance. The recommendations in the reports are generally directed at specific communities. So it's pretty straightforward. If you look through it, you should be able to see whether something is applicable to you or not. And the areas in which we write about are generally about ICANN's mission, DNS, anything related to naming and addressing, and those kinds of threats overall. This is just sort of a look at the recent publications that we've had in this past year. SSAC has commented on the registry transition process, obviously with this new GTLD program which is launching. There's a much greater emphasis on the need to deal with registries. There's a greater expectation that registries may come and go. And so ICANN has been developing a process to deal with that, and SSAC has commented on that. Orphan glue is an issue which is addressed in the applicant guidebook, and we had a technical opinion that we wanted to offer with respect to that. DNS zone risk analysis I'll come back to in a moment. We've recently commented on DNS blocking, its benefits versus its harms. That was a fairly short document, but very directed comment. Certainly this topic has gotten a little bit of attention here this week at the IGF. And most recently, actually recently, within the past week here, we have a document in which we've tried to lay out some terminology and structure with respect to who is, in an attempt to help move the discussions forward. Who is has certainly been an active topic in ICANN for a long time, and in other communities too. This is some of the activities that SSAC is involved in now. We have an internationalized registration data working group, which is looking at taking registration data and what it means to internationalize that. Obviously, the current system tends to focus on ASCII to a large extent. That's what's mandated for the GTLDs anyway, the contracted parties with ICANN. This is the joint working group with the GNSO and SSAC. SSAC now has a membership committee. That's just our evolution into a much more formal organization than we've had historically. Membership was typically based on the pleasure of the chair, with advice from individuals. Now we actually have a whole process that we go through for folks who are interested. You can express an interest and we deal with that. We obviously have an ongoing collaboration within the ICANN community. SSAC makes a point of visiting the other constituency groups during ICANN meetings now in an attempt to bring our work to them. We actually try to specifically call out work that we think is relevant to those groups, call it out to their attention. And we do have a number of inward liaisons that allow some of the other communities inside of ICANN to keep a closer track of the work that's going on. Some activities that we're are now beginning to engage in and getting ready to create some new reports are about dotless DNS. With the new GDLT program, you have brand names as the sort of the canonical example. Would you want to have an @ brand, and what does it mean to do that? So if you have the right-hand side of an email address, or you want to use for services just one label instead of two. And there are issues with respect to that operationally, and SSAC is going to have an opinion and document what we see about considerations in that space. We also want to look at non-US centric DNS filtering. There was recently a technical response to the United States Protect IP proposal. There were quite a number of people, Steve Crocker, Paul Vixie, Dan Kaminsky, and among others, who had produced a nice response to operational considerations with DNS filtering. Obviously, that was fairly well directed at responding to the US proposal, and SSAC is going to take that, and we're looking to abstract that out to make it more generic and non-US specific. And finally, there's more work to be done in WHOIS. ICANN has a WHOIS review team, which is active, and we're waiting for that WHOIS review team to finish its activity and publish its reports. And then we're going to look and see if there's a work item there for us to contribute, to take our terminology and apply it to the activities that are currently ongoing and proposed activities that'll come out of that review team, and see if we can contribute technically to those discussions. The other important thing to note about SSAC is we really are a technical body. We produce advice. We have no leverage in which to ensure that our advice is followed. It stands on its own merits, and we don't offer, our comments are always grounded in a technical position. So we stick to being a technical body. We don't actually create any policy, and we wouldn't want to. That's not the role that we want to play in this community. Background references, I just put this up here to remind people there is a background document that's on the website underneath the workshop description. This is a collection of documents in which SSAC has spoken over the years about DNS cyber attacks and a variety of attacks in a variety of places. And so all of these documents have something to say about DNS threats in one form or another. And what we've done is create a background reference document which has these documents listed and a short abstract about them. You can find the PDF online, and the one-page piece of paper is actually up in the corner of the room there for those who are here and would like to grab that. So that's my introduction to SSAC and some of the ongoing activities. The focus today is on mitigating DNS cyber attacks. And what I want to do first is spend a few minutes and give a little bit of an introduction just to the DNS ecosystem, to get us all on the same page so we all know that we're talking about the same thing. And then we'll move to our panelists here, each of whom will present an opening statement, a position with respect to DNS cyber attacks. And then in the spirit of this being a workshop, the goal here is to interact with the folks in the room. This is your opportunity to ask questions, get some advice, some interpretation or clarity with respect to SSAC documents if you've had a chance to look through some of those. Okay. So the DNS name lifecycle, I want to break it out into 3 parts. I want to talk about it in terms of registration, provisioning, and resolution. Just want to look at some quick pictures here and call out the various parts that go into a DNS system. This picture is intended to represent the registration and provisioning side of the DNS ecosystem. So the red boxes here now that have been highlighted are the registration side. The registrar box is in orange, just to represent that they're not always present. Not all of these parts will be present in all systems. Obviously, there are some CCTLDs in particular that don't take advantage of registrars. But a registrant wants a domain name, and they will have to, through some mechanism, go through a process to acquire that name, getting it into a registry, and a registry has to get that out into the DNS to the registry side of the DNS system, and that's the parent zone, the TLD. That's where the delegation has to appear from the DNS point of view. In addition, the registrant, once they have the name, they have to go through the process of creating their zone file and putting the rest of the DNS information out there, and in particular they have to put the information that's necessary to find their internet services. And the example that I use here is just a web service. So a canonical example is www.example.info. Okay. What I want to do now is take the DNS domain zone and the DNS parent zone blocks, and I want to expand that into, those represent the DNS infrastructure that we want to focus on here in this discussion, and expand that out into these parts. This represents the resolution side, which is the role that the DNS plays in the internet ecosystem. If you want to get access to a service, in this particular example, I chose a web browser. I want to talk to a web server, and I want that particular interaction to work. But this kind of scenario, this set of steps would apply for any kind of web service that one might need to be going for. In order for a web browser to access a web server, it has to make a query looking for how to find that name. Okay. Now I'm going to step through these rather quickly. It's not my intent to go through this in detail. I'm doing it more because just want to make sure that people see all of the moving parts. There are two things that I would like you to take away from watching this sequence of steps as we go through them. One is just the fact that there are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of parts that go with the DNS ecosystem. And what's important in that is there are a lot of places where there could be vulnerabilities or where you are at risk. And I think that's significant because a lot of people, the DNS side of the system here is what happens in the background. You never really see that. People see the web browser and the web server, so they see what displays, but they don't realize all the activity that goes on in the background. And so I think it's helpful and useful to notice that there are a lot of parts and there are a lot of opportunity for threats and vulnerabilities. So the first step is for the browser to ask for how to find the web server. And it will ask typically something local, a resolver. And this resolver will move on and probably ask something else up in the chain, a smarter resolver, if you will, that will do the hard and heavy lifting of going through the process of finding out where that web server really exists. And it typically has to do that by starting at a root server, moving on to a TLD server, so this would be the parent DNS zone, moving on to talking to the zone server until it gets back the actual response, which it then hands back to the stub, which gets it back to the web browser, which then knows how to contact the web server. What's important to keep in mind about that whole sequence is that's a sequence for one lookup. What's interesting about websites in particular is typically there's more than one lookup that's necessary, especially if you look at news websites are a very common example because they're going to have references to a variety of different things on the website, and so you have a lot of names that you have to look up. So this particular lookup sequence, while it looks like it's only 10 steps, it's actually repeated quite a number of times. And then of course the system itself does have certain enhancements, performance improvements. You have caching activities that go on at various places. The protocol has built-in mechanisms for ensuring that you don't have to requery each time you need an answer. You do get a certain amount of ability to store something and save it and use it again. Okay. So with that as an introduction, our ecosystem, we're going to move on to our panelists here and give each of them an opportunity to speak about their view about mitigating DNS threats. The first speaker here is going to be Stefano Trumpi. Stefano is an SSAC member. He's also a member of the GAC. He represents Italy on the GAC in ICANN. He's going to talk about the role of governments, both in ensuring a stable and robust DNS, and about some mechanisms for responding to cyber attacks. And he also has some comments he wants to make about the importance and significance of SSAC and its work in general with respect to internet security. So, Stefano.
Thank you, Eugene. As was said in the introduction, I'm a member of the GAC since the beginning of ICANN, so maybe the senior GAC member. And I served as liaison with the SSAC for several years, and quite recently I became also a member of the SSAC. My background is technical initially, but now I'm much more interested in public policy and trying to intervene and speak with the SSAC in order to convey the, let's call, preoccupations of the governments and inputs that are given to the SSAC. Let me start, first of all, from a general consideration about the role of the SSAC within ICANN. compared to the problem of security and stability in the broad sense. It happened that I've been one of the authors of this final declaration on the internet in the G8, and this is a very interesting general talk about the security, and I read only a few sentences. The first one is: the security of network and services on the internet is a multi-stakeholder issue. And how many times during this IGF you listened to this term, multi-stakeholder? In this case, we intended to say that every part in the internet community, governments from one side, private sector on the other side, and the users of the internet have to work together. And this is one first important point. And work together means not only asking for solutions, but also taking responsibility for whatever is done in the field of security, all the members that I mentioned before. It requires, second sentence, coordination between governments, regional and international organizations, the private sector, civil society, and this gives an idea of this multi-stakeholder participation. Special attention must be paid to all forms of attacks against the integrity of the structure, networks and services, including attacks caused by the proliferation of malware and the activities of botnets through the internet. This just to understand that when talking about security, this field is very large, let's say, because it regards, of course, applications and attacks that are made for different purposes. In this, and this is very important, in this regard we recognize that promoting users' awareness is of crucial importance and that enhanced international cooperation is needed in order to protect critical resources, including, of course, DNS, but not only this. The fact that the internet can potentially be used for purposes that are inconsistent with the objectives of peace and security and may adversely affect the integrity of critical system remains a matter of concern. And of course, the governments have considered nowadays the internet as a critical infrastructure that has to be protected and has to maintain continuity and being at the service of the community. Governments have the role to play, informed by a full range of stakeholders in helping to develop norms of behavior and common approaches in the use of cyberspace. So, and on these issues, the governments are determined to provide the appropriate follow-up in all relevant fora. So then these are quite general statements, but give an idea that the interest of the governments in the problems of security is very vast and is important. Then, as Jim said, the role of ICANN is the role to assure the evolution of the domain name system. And it is important to note here that perhaps, at least for this kind of security aspects, there is one organization that is in charge of the global management of the security aspects. And this is not valid for all other aspects that regard security. And then ICANN may be seen as one organization able to consider all the problems connected to the DNS and try to solve them. of course, ICANN is not alone, because we work with IETF, with the standard organization. We have a lot of support from the top-level aspects in these areas. Let me say, if you think about instead of the interaction of the governments with the Security and Stability Committee, we have, I will mention only some of the points, because as Jim explained it to us, then the studies and the activities of the SSAC have been involved also, for example, in WIS service that is more dedicated to problem of content of information on the registrants and so on. But I will mention very briefly one of the aspects is stability of root zone connected to the process of new GTLDs, and this was explained. And the governments are particularly keen to be assured by ICANN and by the SSAC about the fact that inserting a certain number of new GTLDs will not endanger the response of the system, and this is a very crucial point. So the discussion has been for a long time connected to how many probably per year new GTLDs will be introduced and how the system will be able to respond. Then it is another important aspect that also is connected to mitigating some possible cyber attacks, that is the DNS sec. So having secure DNS, and this is a process that cannot be directed without the intervention of the private sector. It is not something that we can regulate, or sometimes the governments have the temptation of saying that they won't regulate and or influence heavily the private sector, and this is not feasible, and I'm repeating this in several occasions. And then another point is damages to the integrity of the internet connected to filtering or blocking the TLDs, and this is something that we experienced after the approval of the X66, and some governments already declared their intention to block these new GTLDs. And then the problem of filtering is also something that is perceived as damaging the integrity of the network. And this is something that has, of course, a very political issue. And then all these aspects that are the reason of this workshop are connected to cyber attacks in particular. And then so the prevention or fighting cyber attacks is something that the governments would like to know in details, to have numbers, statistics, and try then to interact with ICANN and with the SSAC in order to be convinced that the measures that are taken by the technicians are good enough. And if are not good enough, then the governments would say you should do more, or you should implement something different. So, I have to say that if we look at ICANN in recent years, ICANN is investing a lot on security, also with staff. Also, there is an investment of staff that, of course, interacts with the Security and Stability Committee, and in order to have very precise and efficient provisions in order to mitigate these attacks. The final consideration I want to say is that sometimes governments look at the critical problems and ask for something that could be too costly, not easily implementable, and things like that. So the interaction with the SSAC is always to understand these aspects and to, let's say, try to find agreements on something that is really implementable. Because a perfect situation on security and stability is not possible. We have to understand this and then to do our best in order to mitigate this danger or these attacks to the infrastructure. With this, I finished my brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. I want to use two things that you said to move on to our other speakers here. In the end, when you were commenting about recognizing that protecting your DNS infrastructure is not perfect. It's not possible to offer perfect protection. So you have to look for the best that you can do, and you have to decide what that best is. It's most definitely a risk management problem. And you also spoke directly about the root scaling study that SSAC had done jointly with the root server advisory committee. SSAC ICANN had arranged for a study to be done, which SSAC and RSAC got together and managed. And so our next speaker here is going to be Curtis Lindquist, who comes to us as a root server operator and is going to speak a bit about how the root server system protects itself from the top issues that it faces. So, Curtis.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Curtis Lindquist. I come from NetNode, who run one of the root servers. I'd like to point out that I'm going to talk about us. All the root servers stand independently and they all talk for themselves. I will try and maybe describe a bit what I happen to know about what the others are doing and what I think is more or less public information. In a very basic sense, the root server's primary goal is to simply serve the data as we get from, as published by IANA, and make sure we publish that data and nothing else. We see ourselves merely as publishers of this information. The current threats that we're seeing is not in any way different as any of the operators today. We see a few types of attacks. We see DDoS attacks. Maybe not as much as other parts of the DNS infrastructure, because in a very basic, a very fundamental level, there is actually very uninteresting to attack the root servers because we don't get paid for you who used our root servers. So there is no financial incentive to attack the root servers. That doesn't mean incentives doesn't exist. In the past, there's been some very highly publicized DDoS attacks, so of course it's been very useful probably for the people who wanted to do, who want publicity about what they can do. We see deliberate and undeliberate, most of the time, all the cases I know of, has been undeliberate or well-intended hijacks of some of the root servers and the prefixes they announce. This has mostly been people who've been trying to help the local community. And we've also seen various issues that you see in a routing system of black holing, other issues. These are no other threat than we see of any other part of the internet infrastructure. And in that way, the root servers aren't actually that unique or very interesting to study, to be honest. We also have transport issues where, of course, one of our primary targets is to serve the zone exactly as we receive it out of IANA and be able to prove that we do. And we use the tools from DNS, like TSIG, to actually prove this and validate this. And we also, in varying degree, make sure that the connectivity between our nodes around the world and the distribution centers we have are encrypted and secure. The root server operators doesn't necessarily really coordinate among themselves, but we do tend to share architecture, hardware, software revisions, etc. And I think although it's not an outspoken goal, we have tried to be a bit diverse in what we do as adding to the resilience of the system. And today we have a very different approach to building which hardware we use, what software we use, and how we actually do cycles around this. The root servers also have all picked very varying approaches to the connectivity to enable them to be very distributed. Many of the root servers use Anycast today, and we have 200, I was trying to look at 250, what was the day number? 255 nodes around the world with a mix of v4 and v6. Some of these are local, who only will respond to traffic original locally. Some are global. Again, some of the operators use both local and global, others use mostly local, others use mostly global. So it's a very diverse set of connectivity used. And this is more or less deliberate. We also have very mixed approaches of where we locate this. We have seen a lot of the root servers have today deployed root server copies in developing countries or countries with limited connectivity to help the local communities and help improve the performance, and also, again, to provide a robust and secure infrastructure. One experience we have with our infrastructure is that we saw that the nodes we had in Qatar, for example, a few years ago, when the sea cables towards Europe, FA1 and CME-V3 was cut, and going eastwards, Falcon was cut. It actually helped those countries quite a lot to have a local root server copy when they have very limited bandwidth to the rest of the world. So there's a lot of these efforts being going on to make sure that the infrastructure is robust, and we all are committed to continue to this and deploy more services, as far as I know. At least we are. We also have developed recently more and more tools to monitor performance. And we have, if I talk about us, NetNode, for example, we have our own set of monitoring tools. We also use RIPE's DNS Mon, who actually monitors the performance of all the DNS routes. We tend to use a lot of the routing monitoring systems, so to make sure that we detect in case there's any anomalies in the routing system. So there's a lot of these tools being worked and used by us, and I know that a lot of the other root server operators use other tools. And we try to monitor each other, and we try to share data as much as we can. We have also in recent years improved coordination when it comes to DDoS attacks, and especially gathering data around these attacks. We have collectively shared experiences in how to best do this and how to best actually share this data and try to correlate these attacks. At least as a policy, we do report this to all these attacks to the police, and we do share all the data with them, although it's not very often leads to anything. I wanted to come back to something that Stefano said, though, about how you coordinate this and how you actually discuss, how you work this. We tend to work a lot with established security channels. We are part of the operational community, and in the operational community, there are a lot of existing channels for resolving these issues and try to work security incidents. And all the root servers are very actively taking part in this. And we do share with the operational community what we see and what we do. I don't think we have, at least we don't have a challenge with this. I'd like to address one thing though, and this is not, the root servers, I understand there is a very strong drive for the political system to analyze the DNS, etc., because it's a very crucial part of the system. I also believe that it's actually it's a delicate problem, because if you look, for example, at financial institutions, they are also a very fundamental part of our society, yet we don't ask them to share all the fraud data they have for a simple reason that we don't want to encourage people to go and do this. And this is a very hard trade-off to do. What's the adequate level of reporting and sharing, and what's the adequate level of protection to not encourage people to do more of this? It's a hard question. I don't know the answer to that, and that's at least our belief. Again, I'm talking for us, not for the others. I believe the future risks might be different. We had the GTLD program launched. I don't think the current rate of additions to the zone itself, the actual growth of the zone, as RSAC has said, is not an issue. But we don't really know what these strings will mean. We don't know what will come with which strings will be approved. Will they lead to increased attacks? Will they lead to increased instability in the system? I think my guess is as good as anyone's. They might mean that we have to do closer coordination, other types of coordination, other types of mitigations. We don't know that, and I think it's a bit premature to have a view of it, but it's certainly worth discussing. I think that was enough. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Curtis. If I can just tease out a couple of things that you said, just to make sure that people can grasp onto these. The root server system is obviously, as a whole, a very large infrastructure. And one of the ways that it achieves robustness and ensures its service is partly by being very large, and one of the reasons why it is so large is because there are so many organizations that actually participate and are part of that root server system. You didn't actually give the number, but the number is 12. Right? There are 12 different organizations spread around the world who operate parts of that root server system. So it's very hard to take out the entire system. You would essentially have to mount 12 different attacks, and each of those is also a large infrastructure combined, making a super large one. So diversity in the form of a large number of organizations themselves with large operations. Which brings us down to our next speaker, Ram Mohan, who is the Chief Technology Officer of Afilias. Afilias is also one of the largest service providers and has itself a very large infrastructure in support of its customers. And Ram is going to speak to us about the issues faced by having a large infrastructure and what it means to large enterprises. Ram?
Thank you, Jim. Preserving internet security is almost an oxymoron. There is really security, there is the internet, and each of the organizations that are participating in it have a role to play. And trying to work in this area is an iterative process. Defenders are aware that they must be responsive as well as proactive in order to stay ahead of both real and would-be attackers. In addition, you have software developers who must respond to vulnerabilities. There are other service providers, but the ecosystem of the folks who have to come together to respond to cyber attacks or to DNS threats, it's a large set of providers that are involved there. So when you hear people talk about taking down the DNS, I often look at that and I say, well, that's a pretty big job. What's been built here is a very diverse system and a system that has a multiplicity of players in there. In some cases it can be a weakness, but in most cases that weakness is actually one of the biggest successes and one of the biggest strengths in actually preserving security. Having said that, these days it's very easy for attackers to execute attacks. You look at a DDoS attack, for example, a distributed denial of service attack. Botnets are a phenomenon that has exploded on the world in general. Botnets comprised of thousands of compromised PCs. You can rent them cheaply. Software capable of automating these attacks can be acquired readily on the underground market. And attacks peaking at tens of gigabits per second have been recorded. And the size of these peak attacks have been growing every year. In 2006, the reported size of a peak attack was about 1 Gbps. Last year, the size of a reported attack was around 49 Gbps, about 50 times in 5 years increase in the size. So there's a significant ramp up on that side of the threat area. The other interesting thing that seems to be happening, that large enterprises as well as organizations that are in the business, or like mine, that are in the business of providing infrastructure and therefore have to protect. In addition to DDoS, if you're provisioning domain names, you end up working very deeply and worrying very deeply about issues such as phishing and certainly abuse of domain names. Domain names get allocated, they get provided to various individuals or organizations. And when those domain names end up being used as part of phishing attacks, there's a significant end user impact. Often the organizations that are affected don't even know that they are the target of these phishing attacks, and there are many incidents reported all around the world of financial institutions, other places where information has been compromised by relatively simple phishing attacks. In recent times, there has been more sophisticated phishing attacks. Spear phishing has been a very effective way, which is a kind of a phishing attack that is targeted explicitly at a particular user or a set of users, and leverages information that makes the user believe that the person sending that attack actually knows them. Very effective, and there are again documented instances of governments and entire government agencies that have been targeted that way, allegedly by others, other players, and very effectively extracted information from computers. But if you're a large organization, there are actually relatively more trivial things to worry about. They sound trivial, but the impact can be pretty significant. In my opinion, there are really three providers who basically decide whether you, as a large organization or any kind of an enterprise, three providers who decide whether you will be hacked, whether you will be compromised. A, web hosting providers. They're the most obvious example of such a service. I mean, every company, every organization needs hosting. But if you look at especially medium scale or lower or smaller scale organizations, they don't often have the resources or the expertise or the desire to build and manage their own world-class data centers with redundant peering connections, network and server infrastructure. They outsource it to a hosting provider, and compromise at a hosting provider can have a massive impact all across. The second provider who decides whether you'll be hacked is a domain name registrar. Their security practices can affect you quite significantly. Registrars in many jurisdictions around the world, and in many both GTLDs as well as country code top-level domains, these companies are the interface between your organization and the rest of the domain name system. And they have a critical function. They provision the organization or the individual with a choice of domain name, and they enable you to point your domain to your name servers of choice. And those name servers could be run by you or run by a hosting organization. We've seen several instances in the last few years where credentials for registrar accounts have been compromised, and in so compromising, if the attacker can actually access the registrar account, they don't actually need to do much more. They don't need to hack your website. They just have to go to your provider and compromise that provider. The third provider who may decide whether you'll be hacked are the DNS resolution providers. They're a third potential weak link in the chain, if only because a major class of attacks, cache poisoning, is designed specifically to exploit vulnerabilities in the DNS resolution part of the ecosystem, really the domain name system. For those who don't understand this, cache poisoning is simply an attempt to inject false addressing information into name servers, and the intent is to redirect web traffic, and it's not just web traffic, but generally internet traffic, includes email, etc., to the attacker's servers. In some cases, the attacker simply keeps the data. In other cases, more malicious cases, they are man in the middle. They read the data and pass it on to the intended end source, and often both the person who's been attacked and the person who received the messages, neither of them really are aware that their message stream has been compromised. And Dan Kaminsky a while ago demonstrated a pretty significant vulnerability that leverages cache poisoning. So with all of these threats that a large provider like us actually worry about, one of the things that I've been worrying about more recently, and before I go there, we provision very strongly for that. Many other organizations that are in the same position as us, a TLD operator, a DNS, managed DNS operator, provision in a very strong way, have good practices, etc. But one of the things I've been worrying about in recent times has been what I call the rise of the small botnet. there have recently been, law enforcement and other folks have taken concerted effort to shut down large botnets and to cut off the head of the dragon, if you will, of the hydra. And in many cases, they've been successful. There was last year, the Mariposa botnet, when that got taken down, what was discovered was that it was trying to connect to 12 million unique IP addresses. And those were the number of unique IP addresses that were attempting to connect into the botnet. That's a pretty large botnet. I worry about small botnets. I mean, today you can buy a ready-made botnet for about $2,500 US. You can buy a cloud-based botnet for about $60 per day, and you can buy a 1-hour DDoS attack for about $10. That's about what it costs today in the in the underground, if you will, to buy that. And if you look at a 1-hour DDoS attack, it leverages the cloud, and the botnet operators who are using it not only leverage the cloud, but they give you repeat customer discounts. If you come in for a second hour, or a third hour, you get a bulk rate, and if you buy that along with a compromised list of credit cards, you get a bundled price. So they're using the same economic methods that regular legitimate businesses are using. But I really worry about the small botnets. These botnets are often they can be brought up and turned off pretty quickly. And by the time you actually get your instrumentation ready to go and find it, they may have actually disappeared. I worry about that probably much more than the larger botnets or the larger scale DDoS attacks, because these are, in my opinion, what's coming is a bit more of a guerrilla attack on systems. And as we've read in history, guerrilla attacks are often much harder to defend using traditional, over provisioning and large scale responses, which most of the enterprises that are in the service industry are actually focusing on. So with that set of thoughts, I'll hand it back to you, Jim.
Thank you, Ram. What I wanted to call out specifically about a lot of what you said, and when you went through a very detailed discussion of various kinds of threats and vulnerabilities, and I want to thank you for that. You will find that most everything that Ram had said is actually documented in these various SSAC reports over the years. Most of these things and the activities, these threats that take place, they are described, and in fact some of them have these case studies that he talked about, registrars that have been hacked. You will find case studies documented in those reports too. So if you're looking for issues to care about and ways in which you can deal with them, you can find some specific advice in many of the documents that are already out there. So with that, let me move on to our last panelist. Alejandro Basanti joins us as the chair of ICANN's DNS Security and Stability and Resiliency Review Team. I think I got that name right, didn't I?
That is correct.
That is correct. Okay. So let me turn it over to Alejandro, and he can tell us about that team. And he's going to speak to us about how they are studying the DNS threat landscape and the kind of advice and comments that they hope to provide as that review team comes to the end of its work.
Thank you very much, Jim, and I apologize for late arrival. It's totally my fault. I read two statements in the same email differently. One said it was the last shift of panels. The other one said it was 2:30, and I associated last with 4 p.m. Apologies for that. That's mental state confession. Thank you for your patience for this introduction. My name is Alejandro Basanti. I am a professor at the National University of Mexico, UNAM, and chair of the Internet Society chapter in Mexico, ISOC Mexico. As Jim said, I have been distinguished with the designation of chair of the Stability, Security, and Resilience of the DNS Review Team. A very brief precedent. When ICANN was set up initially, It had a contract agreement with the United States government through the National Technology and Information Agency, the NTIA, which is a unit of the Department of Commerce. This went from an MOU to a Memorandum of Understanding to a joint project agreement where there was still rather tight supervisory power for the NTIA, and there were a number of benchmarks and landmarks that ICANN had to go through. One very significant change, which I think reflects very well on how DNS security is and has to be managed, as well as on the power of the multi-stakeholder approach for Internet governance, is that these documents evolved into the present affirmation of commitments, which is a set of two unilateral synchronized documents where each side states a number of things it's going to do. And ICANN is not therefore anymore under a kind of supervisory authority from the US government. Instead, it has its own benchmarks to fulfill, and there is a multi-stakeholder way to review that these duties to the community and to the Internet are being fulfilled. These take the form of reviews, and there's a number of statutorily defined reviews. The first one that was performed was a review on how ICANN was evolving in accountability and transparency. That one has already been finished, reported upon, and now ICANN is working on how to take up the different recommendations. This is well known. The next two reviews are ongoing. One of them is on WHOIS, where there are a number of both technical and policy issues and some performance questions for ICANN. And the one I'm chairing, which is the stability, security, and resilience. What it's reviewing is whether ICANN is performing well and how it can improve on its duties established in the affirmation of commitments to preserve and promote the stability, security, and resilience, which is a newer request than security and stability of the DNS. This team is built with representation from the ICANN CEO, direct representation from the GAC, and representation which is built bottom-up from the different supporting organizations and advisory councils of ICANN. So it has a pretty strong powers. The review will be a document that will, of course, perform with and deliver with extreme care because of its significance. The review has identified, let me tell you one more thing, which is an observation of one of the team members. There is a kind of, he calls it, and I accept the term, a kind of Heisenberg effect, in that by measuring the thing, you change it. This is a very vague statement for a physicist, but what happens, of course, is that as we start and continue a dialogue with ICANN staff and other stakeholders about how they are performing and managing the security, stability, and resilience of the DNS, of course, ideas come to mind and they are enacted in response to questions the team is making. So we are dealing with a dynamic target, which is good. So in parallel, we have identified, first of all, how a very stark problem that is common in ICANN. And this is the problem of scope. What exactly is ICANN in charge of in the DNS, particularly with regards to stability, security, and resilience? So instead of trying to define a hard line and say, well, you know, ICANN is only responsible for running the L server, which is in its own facilities and run by its own staff, or ICANN has to be held responsible for whatever crazy thing someone in VeriSign decides to do with a server in their charge. Much worse if you consider a server in Sweden or in Japan, some of them under military authority, and there's pretty strong sovereign requirements. This would be a rather pointless task. So what we have done, and as I said, ICANN has been doing the same, is identify three ranges for ICANN's scope. There's the range of that which ICANN runs directly. That would be its own security, its own L server, the access to files that can be damaging, all the way from record of wrong transactions that gave cost to de-accrediting a registrar, lawsuits and stuff like that, which could, destabilizing the organization, destabilize the DNS. So that's sort of what is under direct ICANN management. Then there's a sphere which is under ICANN influence, where ICANN can have a strong influence. This would be, for example, everybody who belongs to the GNSO, to the CCNSO, and to the ASO. Everybody who belongs there is an active participant and a committed participant in developing policy for ICANN, and is therefore committed to the outcomes of those policies. So of course in the GNSO we have a much more binding arrangement than in the CCNSO. The GNSO is run under contractual agreements, and it's pretty tight that once you develop a policy, it becomes part of a contract to which you are bound, particularly for what are called the contracted parties. I hate that term because it sounds like cramped, like their muscles are in pain. But certainly the parts under contract and the uncontracted parties, which are not very relaxed, I see them very agitated, but they are the parties that are not with a contract with ICANN, and that would be, for example, the at-large, which encompasses users of the DNS in many ways, including people who actively purchase and sell domain names, and many others. And then there's a third sphere, which is basically not under ICANN's management and under no ICANN influence or very, very limited ICANN influence, which then must be managed more on a contingency planning basis. That would be where the botnets are built that Ram mentioned. That would be where people are devising the attacks that use the DNS. As probably you have already mentioned, when we look at DNS security in particular, security invites the analysis of attacks or threats, and there are basically two kinds of attacks that have to be dealt with, which are attacks that are directly against the DNS infrastructure, whether against the root or whether against users' DNSs, but which actually intend to damage the DNS, and attacks which, without crippling or horribly altering the content of the DNS, use the DNS actively, not only, let's say, for resolution, but they do things like fast flux. We would say that fast flux, I may be wrong here, but we would say that fast flux is a type of example of an attack where you are mostly using the DNS without damaging it irreversibly or not making it available. So it's more like a platform for another kind of attack that's not on the DNS, whose target is not the DNS. In those cases, ICANN has very little chance to influence what happens, but on the other hand must be prepared on a contingency plan basis, because these things could actually hurt even the L server, for example, even ICANN's ability to operate, or ICANN's ability to convene meetings and so forth. So that's a very general framework of analysis about scope. And as I said, scope, I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm a founder of ICANN, or came 3 days after the foundation, and I'm not surprised that scope is a matter that's always under definition. That's I mean, Sabine and I wear the scars of defining the scope of ICANN for the CCNSO and so forth. So that's one big question. The other big question we're looking at this moment is how, where, when, by whom the risk framework for the DNS is analyzed, established, built, and worked upon. And again, this has a number of vague, fuzzy, not vague, but fuzzy borders between subsets. And there's a significant development which I think will be one can foresee that will be deserving comment on the report when it comes out in a few months, when it's finalized and out, which will be the fact that ICANN has built from the start a very, very strong awareness and operation in the security and stability space, and it has grown to the resiliency space as well, which is the SSAC, which you have already described during the session, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. The Security and Stability Advisory Committee has performed well. It has been, this is not the SSRT's opinion. It is the published SSAC review that says so. So I can say confidently that the SSAC operation has been seen as good by its own reviewers, by independent reviewers who concentrate on the SSAC. However, the SSAC has not performed fully responsibility on establishing, defining, and minding the evolution of the threat or risk landscape and framework for the DNS. There are many reasons. This is not a place to discuss them. This is a decision that has been vetted by the ICANN board, and the process is in this responsibility is in the process of being transferred to a multi-stakeholder cross-constituency group called the DSSA. The DSSA is a response to some motions by ICANN in the security space, which the community has identified as preferable to have a more bottom-up, more distributed approach. That's the DSSA. What we are analyzing right now are documents and other inputs, interviews and so forth, to try to find out what would be the optimal recommendation for a mechanism which can be useful for the DSSA. And on the other hand, here's another Heisenberg measurement problem, which is that the DSSA is doing its own work, and we want to be very appreciative of what is already being provided by the DSSA. The DSSA has already provided, for example, a large list of threats and risks to be managed. It's not yet structured, it's not yet prioritized, it's not yet segmented in many necessary ways, but it's there, and we believe that we have to be mindful of it. So unless Jim and Ram, who know this process closely, want me to make more specific points, I think this is a fair point to place to stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro. So you're right, I had not intended to, not included the DSSA in this activity, so I'm glad that you mentioned that and called that out. The SSR work is about evaluating ICANN's role in protecting the DNS, its security, stability, and resiliency, and the DSSA working group is actually engaged in producing that threat and risk framework that Alejandro spoke about. So it's an important distinction to make, and so there's a lot of activity in that space and in that community. One question for you, Alejandro, you said a few months for the SSR output. Can you be a little more specific about your timeline?
Yes. Remember that the cycles of ICANN work are in part geared to a time frame that is defined by the ICANN meetings. For one reason, even if you had, even if we took the extreme view of holding the review, managing the review as an audit by independent auditors, we still have to make consultations to the community. We want for this to be a community-fed, community-aware process with significant community input and feedback on what we begin to put out. So we are geared to the timings of the meetings. For the upcoming meeting in Dakar, what we're working on, which we'll hopefully publish next week, is a set of questions and discussion points where we will be well served by having community input and feedback on questions like I've mentioned. What exactly is the concerns of the community about the scope, or maybe overreaching scope or not enough scope of ICANN in each of these three spheres? Things like that. These are coming from the work that we have already done. We have started both drafting what would be the structure of the final document and finding there the gaps and holes in information or informed opinion that are needed. So we expect to have that draft by the next ICANN meeting, which unfortunately, I think we can have a very substantial piece of work done much earlier, but the next ICANN meeting after the one in Dakar at the end of October will be already in, I think it's February 2012 in Costa Rica. So that will be the cycle for when we expect to put out a large, comprehensive, but not final in any way, draft for public comment and deliver for the ICANN meeting after that one. That would be what we can foresee about it. We're trying to compress time so that the next ICANN meeting, as I said, in Costa Rica, will have a really pretty complete, comprehensive piece of work for the community to comment upon. And what we know from many of these review processes, I've run many of them before the AOC, is that at that point we will get very substantial comment, but it will also be very disparate. It will be diverging in opinions in many different directions. So it will take significant, not only time and energy, but courage to process in order to be aware that everybody has spoken and yet differ from some who will say that their comment is not listed in the final document and therefore it was not listened to, and it's very subtle the way it actually did shape it.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you to all of the panelists again for being here today to talk about DNS cyber attacks. We are now up to about 15 minutes before the top of the hour, but this is the time when we would open up the discussion for questions and comments from the floor. While people think about if they have a question or not, and they'd like to, let me look down the end of the table here and ask, do we have any remote participants?
Yes, we do have one remote participant, but so far there's been no question asked.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So let me look around the room once. Anyone want to raise their hand? Do you have a question about DNS, anything related to DNS cyber attacks security that you'd like to pose to our panel? Okay, I will choose one to put to the panel. So Ram actually took the opportunity to comment about what worries him the most with respect to DNS cyber attacks, and he spoke about the rise of the small botnet. So question that I put to all of the panelists, the others in particular, or if Ram wants to speak up and offer a second choice of something significant, is what would you say in particular with respect to the root zone and the TLZ zone? That is the focus of the discussion here, although we'll take anything that you might want to offer up. What would you say is probably one of the most significant threats facing the DNS today?
Yeah, the DNS as a system or operations?
I'll leave that open for you to answer either your own operation or both. Yes.
I think that for the DNS system, I think we as Ram was hinting at, I think we'll see more advanced version of the attacks we're seeing already, more phishing-like, more. I don't think we'll see any, in the short term at least, any new type of attacks. I think that as you see more IDN coming on board, we'll see more of those issues. We'll have more issues of that in maybe the GTLD space. I've heard him saying that DNS as a system will after 25 years, all of a sudden show up with anything new. When it comes to the actual operation of the systems, I do believe, as Ram said, we see DDoS attacks are increasing, and we see the type of attacks increasing, and small botnets is a good observation. These attacks aren't necessarily unique for the DNS, by the way. I mean, they are general towards anything you can make money off of the internet. I mean, a lot of these attacks are extortion attempts, right, or people trying to make some sort of financial gains. For the root zone, for us specifically, I think that the new GTLDs probably pose challenges we haven't thought of yet. I mean, we will see a shift of attacks towards the root servers. We already see, I mean, it's interesting that I think we see more attacks now than we saw 5 years ago towards the roots. I can't really quite explain why. I suspect that part of the reason is that it's a very distributed system and it's a very good way to test your tools, to be honest. Because, again, as opposed to a lot of the other services, we are not anything you will stand to gain much from. We are seeing some different types of attacks in that. With the new GTLDs, of course, a lot of the attacks we today see on secondary domains will go to the root servers, absolutely. I don't think that is necessarily an issue. I think we're well provisioned. We handle fairly large DDoS attacks today, but they will increase, absolutely.
Stefano?
I would like not to propose a number one, but a general statement about threats. And I was intrigued by the idea of concluding the work of the panel, making sort of an inventory of the threats. And that is done by this other group, I don't remember the SSA. So looking from a governmental point of view, of course, we need numbers. So evaluate, if you make a list of threats, because otherwise the danger is that they will be considered as worries, major worries without any distinction among them. So, and this evaluating the damage and the possibility that this happens is something that is really, really important in order then to evaluate how to make measures in order to slow down the possible impact. Because then also in security, you can have some small thing regarding security that would need a lot of effort, I mean financial and also in the engagement of the private sector. While in other cases, you can have something that can be easily implemented with no problem. So this idea of the list of threats has to be complemented in the way I suggest.
Stefano is indeed on track, in my opinion, and in the group's opinion, in the review team's opinion. It's not as easy as it sounds, for two reasons. First, because there will never be a comprehensive final list of threats to anything, much less on the internet. There's always a zero-day attack looming. There's always someone going to discover something new that's flawed in a system, or some new way to exploit things that are not flawed, which actually become a vulnerability and therefore a threat. So whoever starts work like that, aiming for a comprehensive list, and then, you know, next year we only have to work with the threats, is wrong. You have to monitor constantly where the new threats are coming. Second, the team very early found, as many others do in this field, that working from threats is a good approach, but working from risks is a better approach. Because when you work with a risk framework instead of a threat landscape, you are already forcing yourself to factor in impact, probability, cost, and you are doing a cost-benefit analysis as well. You know it's risky. What the team, this is also important because it defines what the team's mission is. The team's mission is not to create ICANN's security. Much less is it to create the 13 root servers security or the 200 Anycast copies of the root servers security or anything else. I mean, none of these attacks that Ram has mentioned, for example, are something that goes directly from a rocket in space, from a satellite in space to a root server. It goes through other networks. So there's no way to make a comprehensive list even of what the system is under attack. So what we're looking at is how ICANN is managing this, how ICANN is building its threat landscape, its risk framework, and how much this happens, as it has to be, with the way that the root server system is run, with or without the cooperation of the root server operators. An interesting finding is that everybody has claims on everyone else's transparency. So you as GAC want ICANN to be transparent to you and tell you where the root servers are, what version of software they run, what bandwidth they have available, and under whose authority they are. And you want ICANN to tell you their threat landscape and how they plan to manage every risk. And ICANN will tell you that they can tell you a lot, but there are a few things that they better not make completely public immediately. And the root servers will tell you that they want perfect transparency from ICANN, but they will not provide you even the versions of software that are running on each root server, because that would facilitate attacks. And we can spend a whole afternoon pelting them with stones against a wall for trying to manage security by obscurity. But the fact is, you will kill them, but they will not tell you. So Yes, there's interest in a comprehensive threat management, risk management framework. The most important thing is that the mechanisms exist for its constant evolution.
Let me just add one comment. We've mentioned a couple of times about the DSSA, which is the DNS Security and Stability Analysis Working Group. And we've mentioned the fact that they have their threat list, and they've created a, well, I'm going to call it comprehensive. It's a comprehensive collection that they've put together. Now, I participate in that group on behalf of SSAC, and I will only observe that they created their initial list of threats that they are now working through in an attempt to organize by reading through all of the DNS, the SSAC documents, the list that you have over here in our background document, as well as many others, and look through there to find anything that was DNS related. And that's how they created their initial threat list that they wanted to put together. So let's see, we have a question from the floor, and then we'll come around this way back to the panelists. So Sabine?
Here's Sabine Leurer from DNIC. It's actually more a comment than a question. When Alejandro always is elaborating about the stability of the DNS and the responsibility from ICANN for that, I think it's very important to point out that it's not ICANN being responsible for the stability and the security of the whole DNS as a whole. It's obviously it's like making somebody responsible and for the stability and the guarantee of the traffic system on the world. So there are different operators, and the different operators collaborate together. So there are people within the DNS, like in the traffic system worldwide. There are people being responsible for air traffic. There are people responsible for ship traffic. There are people responsible for building the roads, the last road to the house. And and only if that everything is working fine, you will come from one house to the another using the taxi, the ship and the plane, and on the other hand side, the taxi account. So within the DNS, there are different operators, and the operators together build up a system which together works quite well, or which together has to work robust and stable. But there is not a single responsibility from one entity that the whole system works. I think that is very important to make that very, very clear. And I think what ICANN facilitates is the collaboration of those operators being responsible for their part of the system. Being responsible for DE, I have a contractual relationship for to 40.8 million single domain name users that I actually maintain their DNS system within the whole framework worldwide. And similar responsibilities have others. So I think it's very important to clarify that there is, of course, a responsibility with all those single operators. And there is, and I think it's important to let the responsibility by those, because then they can take it. And not taking away the responsibility from them and say, oh no, we are the oversight, we tell you what to do. So I think it's very, very important to make that very clear.
Thank you very much for that comment. You're right. In the beginning, I had talked about the DNS system having many parts. And it's important to recognize that, yes, there are many parts, and there are many players who operate all of those parts. And so it is a very large system, and no single person can control all of it. Next had his hand up was Curtis.
Yes, I wanted to respond a bit about what the root service does and doesn't. Alejandro wasn't here when I spoke, and I said, again, I think that it's not necessarily root service doesn't want to share. It's also the fact that if you look at a lot of other industries where we have this security, and I said financial services, they don't share data either, because you don't want to encourage people to. I mean, there are certain operational parameters they share, but under very, very strict control of how this information is used, and also where this information comes with understanding, for example, software versions, etc. I don't actually think we have a big question. Sharing this, I think there was you referred to a very specific incident. I think there was more a bit of how the question was actually put. But anyway, we don't have an issue with sharing, or at least we don't have an issue sharing, but we want to know for what reason and how this information is interpreted, and under what authority. I mean, there is an interesting point here is that what I'm going to say now, don't take this literally, but to play devil's advocate, ICANN is very good at asking for to have, for example, the root of operators and the other communities be responsible and take, the blame if something goes wrong. ICANN itself always backs down when someone tries to hold them accountable, like when GAC wants to have questions towards the ICANN. And this discussion of being accountable, it's not as simple as asking the root server operators, the CCTLDs, the GNSO, etc., or GTLDs operators to be accountable. It's a much, much more complex question, accountable to who and why. And I think we had to look at it in a much broader perspective than just go pick on, you know. I know the router service operators are very popular to pick on, but you know, that doesn't help the question.
Thank you. Ram?
Thank you. Sabina's intervention was very timely and certainly completely appreciated. It is a shared ecosystem. But the one thing that strikes me, and you know, Alejandro, this is, and Stefano, when you're talking about ICANN, its role, etc., the one thing about DNS security or working in this area is that this is a system that imposes shared risk, but individual responsibility, right? And that is something that means that we require a common set of baseline. What are the baseline risks that must be managed, must be mitigated? What are the ways to go do that? And whether that is done in an open manner or from among the security operators, you know, you could debate it. I tend to fall much more in it should be done among those who are trusted. But because there's individual responsibility and that's not held to a common minimum standard, I think there lies some of the weaker links in the DNS ecosystem. And if there is attention and effort that should be directed, it should be directed there. You look at the root server attacks that had happened before, one of the things that it identified was you know, the value of Anycast. And after the first, you know, large-scale attack that was publicized in 2002, you look at the next one in 2006, and the 2006 attacks demonstrated, in many ways, the value of Anycast, right? So the minimum standard, I think, is what probably needs to be focused on. And because it is a shared risk and individual responsibility model, we have to focus on what is the minimum individual responsibility, what is that minimum bar, and then help make sure that those who need it have the tools and the instrumentation to actually work on it.
Thank you. Alejandro, you wanted to add a comment?
I only need Chuck Gomez to come to the microphone so that all the communities that make our work lively and interesting, not to say difficult, have expressed why it is so. And it is this kind, it's the reviewing or even measuring or establishing or analyzing or even describing DNS security is a fantastic challenge. And I don't say this by, to aggrandize the work we have to do or to minimize or as a euphemism to say that, guys, please help us. Huh? But I really mean it's very challenging. When I started defining the problem by explaining by expounding on the difficulty of establishing the scope of the work on DNS security, I can only thank you, Sabine, Curtis, Ram, and I would thank Chuck if he took the microphone, and of course Stefano, because the CCNSO, the root server operators community, the SSAC, the GAC, and with Chuck, that will be also the GTLD operators, would be telling us why it's difficult to define the scope. It's a large cooperative system. When it works well, I am proud of the way my laptop runs its DNS and how I keep its tables clean. And I can say, you know, I'm part of the success of the DNS, together with a couple billion users of the internet. When it fails, then it's nobody's sole responsibility, and it's like, okay, who to blame? So I mean, this is the virtue of distributed cooperative systems. It's one system. It's operated by many. It has very specific responsibilities. If you went into another, let's say, an after-action review after an attack that was successful and then was successfully recovered from, you would find a few heroes and a few losers. But that's not the point. The point is to see, again, what is ICANN's responsibility and how well it is performing it. And that includes the phrase, it would include the phrase, given the challenge of the distributed cooperative nature of the system.
Thank you. We are actually just past the top of the hour, so I want to take one last look around the room and ask if there was a question from the floor. And I want to take the opportunity then to offer 3 points that I believe that I heard here, and then I will go down the panelists and ask them for a closing comment, and if they want to clarify or in any way add to my summary points. This session is about mitigating DNS cyber attacks. We've been focused on you know, the DNS infrastructure itself, in particular at the root and the TLD level. I believe that I've heard 3 things with respect to the way in which one could, things that you can do to help protect yourself. When Curtis was speaking, he talked about over-provisioning. You know, the root server system is creating a super large system, so you get over-provisioning from the point of view of having multiple providers, each contributing a large system and putting it together to create a super large system. So this, just by definition, has a way of creating a fairly stable and robust opportunity and form of protection. We've also heard discussions about diversity. So Curtis made reference to having multiple operating systems and hardware. You know, Ram has also spoken about over-provisioning and diversity and being able to do that. It's very nice from the point of view of a large service provider. But the question here is there advice or comments that we can offer to the community at large in what it can do going forward? What can a smaller person do to protect themselves, to help their own DNS cyber attacks that might come to them? So over-provisioning diversity. The third item, and Ram had mentioned this, was creating a common minimum standard. And wondered if anyone could speak to the presence or absence of that. I would say that maybe we'll get some comments with respect to that from the SSR, I would hope, and maybe you could speak to that in your closing comments. So with that, let me start down there with Curtis and look for closing comments.
I think the discussion we had at the end, I mean, from my speaking just at root server, and I have to admit that I might be the only person of the root server who agree with what I'm saying now, but I actually think that having some sort of oversight would be better, at least some sort of transparency on this. I'm not against that, but I just think that just calling for accountability simplifies the matter way too much, because it is a much harder problem. It's a much larger discussion to be had. And also, I actually think that to some extent, people are accountable today. When we had the big root server attacks that Ram mentioned in the past, the root servers were actually very transparent. We did publish what happened, and to the extent we know it. And it was something I don't think has been ever said publicly, but there was actually police investigations and law enforcement follow-up on that. I mean, when it comes to the minimum standards, I think that it's important that they take it, speaking about the root server system, it's important that they take into account the diversity, that you don't ask everybody to meet the same standard, because that also is a risk to be a lock-in effect. But I agree that having at least this transparent and published in some way would be a really good way. And I also think that, again, this is my highly personal opinion, I think that we all stand to gain from more transparency, because I understand that there's a public interest or a government interest into being reassured and being at least able to say that we actually knew about this, and we have trust in this, and you have to create trust and you earn trust. And so I'm not against this, but I think it's a complex process moving forward.
Thank you, Curtis. Ram?
Well, if you're a registrant, if you're somebody who owns a domain name, or you're someone who runs a company that provisions for such things, probably looking at some of the SSAC reports might yield tremendous value in what kind of security things you should do. There is, if you're an actual registrant, an owner of a domain name, there are again some SSAC reports that provide clear, specific, point-by-point recommendations on the various things you can do to safeguard yourself. There are also recommendations in the SSAC reports about what you can do as a user of a consumer of these services, not necessarily somebody who owns a domain name, but somebody who actually simply is using the internet and using the domain name system that underlies it. So I'd say if there is probably one really good thing you can do is to go try and read some of these reports. They're written in a pretty accessible format, in my opinion. They're rendered by technical experts, but they're written not always for a technical audience. So often the language is written in a very much more accessible manner. And the most recent set of SSAC reports are actually in the process of being translated into the various languages that ICANN actually translates them into, which hopefully will make it even more accessible, and that's a trend that I expect will continue to come through. So I think that's really what I would suggest. Actionable things that people listening to this session, both here remotely or reading transcripts later, should do. There is already a raft of good material. Let's try and make use of them instead of trying to create new material or new, identify new challenges that we should try and work on.
Thank you, Ram. Stefano, closing comment?
Okay, coming from the definition that DNS is a large cooperated system, then I could say that about security, there is a core of semi-binding, let's say, semi-binding recommendations connected with the standards and with some of the existing contractual ICANN relation with, in particular, GTLDs. But I would say that the core that I define as semi-binding is very minor. And then there is a cooperation and responsibility between the actors. And if we look in particular at country codes that are much less regulated by ICANN than GTLDs. Sometimes the governments are more comfortable if they see binding contracts, let's say, that oblige to verify that certain recommendations are really implemented. And this is the problem sometimes that creates comments of the government, for example, for root servers. And then finally, we have to involve more and more, and ICANN and also the service provider should be more proactive in promoting awareness of the registrants, of the users, so let's say, because at this point, with the distribution of responsibilities and taking responsibilities by all the actors, this system will improve.
Well, let me make this very specific before for or as a closing comment, but maybe before. So let's say, Stefan, I mean, let's make this a little bit lively. Who in the GAC, and what is your forecast? I mean, can this be done? Can the GAC be persuaded that the informal cooperation that exists between the root server operators and the fact that some of them consider themselves accountable to specific communities which are not within the ICANN structure, what is the likelihood that that will be approved, let's say, within 6, 12, 18, or 36 months by the GAC? What does it take? I mean, because we always get this from the GAC, you know? I mean, we get from the GAC, you should, and there's, it would be very nice to see we will.
Okay, it's hard to answer clearly to this question.
I'm not the only one facing hard to answer questions, right?
We need a very continuous education, let's say, also to understand why something is not connected to real contracts, because this is an important measure against then distributed denial of service to the root server and things like that.
So let me ask you a very specific, make it very specific for you.
Yeah.
I will make this very specific for you, Stefan. And I'm sorry for the speed, please, scribes, I apologize for the speed. It's the liveliness of the discussion. So do you think that understanding the distributed system of the root servers is a high school thing, a college level thing, a master's, or a PhD level thing?
Not all the governments
for a single
like to study. Not on first of all.
Would you agree that 13 years of ICANN existence is enough for high school,
and then
college?
Let me finish. And then you always will find the same objections. Why 13 root servers, 10 are in the United States, 2 in Europe, 1 in Japan. So the risk is that this can activate a very political framework, let's say, and discussion, trying to put into a crisis the basis of the system, let's say. So we have to be very careful about that. And
let me just make a very quick summary of this. ICANN has existed for 13 years. That's the time it takes most people to go through junior high, senior high, to use the American equivalents, or from the first to the sixth form in the British system, through university, master's, PhD, and probably a couple of years of postdoc if you look at higher education. So you're saying that a part of ICANN is not educatable, or that the question is not of education? And to finalize, are we doomed or not?
Okay, I think we need to end with that question and thank our panelists for being a part. We should have started that lively discussion back when we first started discussing. Let me thank everyone for coming and staying with us here for our next 15 minutes past the hour. I hope that you found this interesting and useful, and we'll see you next year.
And thank you, Jim, for moderating. Thank you very much.